Okay, well, we will get started now. Just to begin with about the Torah portion this week, Parshat B'Shalach. It's an extremely important one in many ways, because everybody knows that the Jews supposedly wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Where'd that come about? Why did that come about? So we're told in the Torah that it's kind of an ambiguous language. God says to Moshe, Shlach v'cha nashim, send out for yourself people to spy out the land. And according to most of the traditional commentaries, it really wasn't something that God wanted. But he said, you guys really want it? Okay, do it. When am I going to stand in your way for that sort of thing? But so there was one representative from each of the 12 tribes, and they go out and they go through the land. They see it's wonderful, fruitful. There's all kinds of good stuff there. They bring back grapes, a huge cluster of grapes that it takes two guys with two poles to carry that grape cluster. That's why the tourism ministry in Israel, that's their symbol. All right. So they say it's a great place, but we can't do anything. We can't conquer it. They're too strong for us. They're like giants, what have you. So 10 of the 12 give a very despondent and report. And two of them, Joshua and Caleb, try to give a positive report, and there's all kinds of get back and forth. But in the end, they give up hope. And they're almost ready to kill Moses or Joshua. And so God says, okay, they went through the land for 40 days. So you're going to be in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day of the spying out of the land. And that is what takes place. Now, actually, this is already the second year. So it's not exactly like it's meant full 40 years. It was really only 39. And as a lot of modern Bible critics point out, the number 40 is, like we use dozens. There were a couple of dozen people there. Does that mean really 24? Or I mean, it's a way of figure. So it's not little, but it's not huge. So that is the suggestion where the 40 comes in throughout biblical accounts. But in any case, the Israelites are not allowed to enter into the land of Israel. All that generation that was of age, 20 and upward, all the men at least would have to die in the Midbar, in the wilderness, before they could enter into the land of Israel. You're not used to driving, okay. We're just going over the Torah portion. So according to the calculations of the rabbis made, this event, where they were told they cannot enter into the land of Israel, came out on the 17th of Tammuz. Okay, we'll come across that more next week when we talk about the some minor holidays and things that are left on the calendar that we haven't touched upon. But it made that a terrible day for the future. The siege of Jerusalem, the walls are breached on the 17th of Tammuz, etc., that kind of thing. So they are left to wonder. The Midrash, the rabbis sometimes, I think, have an interesting sense of humor. Says what they did was each night, or on the anniversary night, there's different versions of it, but they would dig their grave. Everybody who was over 20 would dig their grave, and that's where their bed was that night. They got up in the morning, okay. If not, then all you had to do was fill in the grave. Yeah. That's why I say I think it's a case of rabbinic humor or lack thereof. They were probably fathers and grandfathers already, and that's why they had that kind of humor. My grandson already knows to complain about my jokes, and his other grandfather's jokes. Okay. Tonight, we're supposed to talk about varieties of Judaism. Part of the issue is, has there ever really been one unified religious philosophy, let's call it? highly unlikely in a total sense of the term. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was alive at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, who wrote a history of that rebellion and of the Jewish people, he records that at that period of history, around the year 70, there were basically divisions within the Jewish people. There were the Sadducees. The Sadducees mostly represented the priestly class. And they, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call them conservative, but that's not really an appropriate designation. But they pretty much stuck to the letter of the law as it was found in the Torah, although we found from Dead Sea Scrolls and other things indication that it's a more complicated issue, complex situation than that. But anyway, according to rabbinic tradition, these are the bad guys. The descendants of Tzadok, Tzadukim, and they become the enemies of the Pharisees. Pharisees is a second grouping within the Jewish people. And the Pharisees are the ancestors of rabbinic Judaism. So there are our ancestors, obviously they were the good guys. We know, and Josephus talks about the Essenes or Essenes. They led almost a monastic lifestyle. Some of them may have been celibate. It's not clear. They broke away from what was going on in the temple, set up their own communities. Again, we don't know a lot. Josephus admires them and says a little bit about them, but we don't know a lot. The Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran are subjects of great debate. Do they represent the works of the Essenes? Was Qumran an Essenian community? Was the library, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the caves near Qumran, was that their library, or was it something else? There's no complete agreement on them or on the relationship to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they were I've seen in some ways to have ideas and approaches that are thought to at least reappear, if not be in Christianity, some of the things. And then there were those who were the zealots. Their only thing was they wanted to revolt against Rome. They didn't want to get rid of Roman rule. Josephus puts everything on their shoulders, blames them for everything, the revolt, to try and get it off the shoulders of the rest of the Jewish people, so the Romans will leave the rest of the Jews alone. But in any case, so we have these four groupings. And then you had everybody else. Amcha, as we say, the people of the land. And we know from the, what can we know for sure? There are the Dead Sea Scroll writings that at least tell the story from one perspective of some of the ideas. Rabbinic tradition, the Sadducees only live on in what may be still existing amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were the other side, often. So sometimes from the argument, you can kind of discern what their argumentation was. Rabbinic tradition condemns them completely. They're no goodniks, all right? And like I said, Josephus doesn't really give us a lot of information. And again, if you look at it from a modern historian's perspective, when you look at the information we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud and other rabbinic writings, you would think that the Pharisees ran everything. But it's very clear that the Sadducees had control over the temple and the Sanhedrin. And even later on in the Talmudic era, it's very clear that there was the rabbinic group, rabbinic party, if you have it as you would, and then there were the ordinary Jew, whatever that meant at that stage of history. Right? And there's a wonderful book of Chista's daughter, which is a really, it's a fictional account, but the author, she based a lot upon what you can bring out of rabbinic material to try and paint a picture of that era. This is around, I think it's around 300 of the Common Era, give or take, something like that. So now, so we see that even at the very beginnings, then where do you plug the Christians in? How do they fit into that schema? We know that the earliest Christians were Jews. We know eventually they departed from the Jewish people. There was a split. Most likely, it really came to the forefront with the destruction of the temple. And as the church grew, it became more and more Gentile, and the Jewish influence became less and less. But there's some who want to suggest that they were another group amongst the Jews, another sect amongst the Jews. So when we look at that early period, there are various groups. There's not one group that can really, I think, honestly claim mastery on the religious world of that era. With others are heretics. It's always, everybody else is always a heretic. If you don't agree with me, you're a heretic. That's the simplest way of life. And as Jews moved to different areas, they developed some different customs here and there. Again, the Talmud is very cognizant of that. Even in the Mishnaic period, there were different customs. For example, they talk about those communities where people would work on the day before Passover, they could work. Those who didn't work on the day before Passover didn't work. You follow your local custom. And as Jews spread out around the Mediterranean and further to the east and to Iraq and to India even, then westward to Spain and northern Europe, different customs began to develop. And we have clearly a division between Sephardic customs and interpretations and Ashkenazic interpretations. Now, they all saw themselves as one Jewish people, but it's very clear that there were some differences that existed. And then in the 17th century, after the catastrophe with Shabtai Tzvi and his messianic pretensions, the Hasidic element came into being. There was bitter fights at the very beginning of the Hasidic movements, again, with people calling each other heretics, what have you. And the interesting thing was, while the Hasidim at their origins, they were the anti-establishment, today they're very much a part of the right-wing religious establishment. Although there's still memories of the days of bitter quarrels. There was a story goes that one of the important one of the important Haredi Orthodox rabbis of what they call the Yeshivish Lithuanian approach was once asked what was the closest religion to Judaism, and he supposedly said Lubavitch. Okay, so we still there's still echoes of that in the Jewish community, but it's if you go to a Hasidic today, if you go to a regular Hasidic synagogue shtibel, even though their siddur is a little bit different from the standard Ashkenazic siddur, you can daven. If you know the siddur, you know how to daven. It's not a problem. What really changes and which really causes a rupture is modernity. The French Revolution and what followed the French Revolution vis-a-vis Jews as citizens of the countries in which they lived really set the snowball effect. Because until that moment, Not to say there weren't differences, the Shabtai Tzvi example, the Hasidim, and there are always fights back and forth. It says, Talmidei Chachmim Marbim Shalom, rabbinic students or rabbis increase peace in the world. No, they don't. They fight with each other all the time. It's a joke rather than a true statement. But they still saw themselves under the same umbrella. Okay? Despite differences, the core theology was fairly much the same. God gave the Torah at Sinai. You could go through Maimonides' 13 Articles of Faith. You had to believe those 13 Articles of Faith to be a good Jew. You had to observe the Sabbath and the holidays and kasher. Now, you might differ on some of the elements of each one of those things, but you were committed to them, despite how you might differ here and there. And the Jewish community, since it existed as a corporate enterprise, in other words, you were not a citizen of France. You, a Jew, was a member of the Jewish community that was allowed to live in France. But your relationship to the French country or citizenship was not as a citizen. You weren't a citizen. And so now along comes the French Revolution and stirs things up, stirs the pot up in France and in Germany and all throughout Western Europe. And finally, what happens is the Jewish community as a corporate existence gets very much weakened. Up until then, if you were part of the Jewish community and you wanted to open your shop on Shabbos, you're going to get hell from the community. Right? You just couldn't do it. There was no, and they're enforcers, and so nobody do business with you, all kinds of other things. Okay, so there was communal control. So that breaks down when a French Jew becomes a French citizen. They are no longer part of the corporate existence. Each individual now becomes part and parcel of the general community, and they are essentially, to some extent, free to act as they want to act. So that communal control that maintained traditional approaches and practices weakens. And some Jews weakened in what they wanted to observe and started moving away from the Jewish observances. And so the roots of Reform Judaism really lie in the French Revolution and its aftermath. Jews could dress as they wanted. They didn't have to wear special badges anymore until Hitler, Yimach Shemo. They could follow occupations that they wanted. They weren't limited by law to certain occupations. Many Jews settled outside of the Jewish districts, what we call the ghetto, because even if it was not an enforced ghetto, even today, you go to Thornhill and certain areas in Thornhill, you might as well be in a ghetto, or south around Bathurst and Eglinton and north and south of there. Right? They could live wherever they wanted. If they made money and they got wealthy, you didn't want to stay where everybody, although the hoi polloi. Right? So, and they, not that anti-Semitism didn't exist, but they got their nice big homes and far away from the synagogue. And if they wanted to go to the synagogue, the only way to get there was a horse and carriage, that sort of thing. And they began to live like their neighbors, dress like their neighbors, speak the language of the land in which they lived, attended public schools and universities, began to neglect Jewish studies and disregard Jewish law. All right, so in terms of the time frame, in 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, Jews lost the rights of citizenship in several countries. And so many Jews who liked what it meant to be a citizen, what privileges and what came from that, were prepared to become Christians in order to maintain those rights and privileges. So now what should the response be to what's going on? That was the challenge. And thoughtful Jews were very concerned about this. They realized that many of these changes took place not because they disliked Judaism, but to get better treatment. And as the rise in secular education, everything came, was, again, some doubts and issues about the Sabbath and things like that. And also around the same time, there began a new approach to the study of Judaism, which has got a fancy German terminology, Wissenschaft des Judentums, really the science of Judaism. In the liberal arts, at least in one period of time, I don't know what the story is these days, but one time, there was this urge, this push to make liberal arts as scientific as possible, right? Because we have the scientific method, you tested things, what have you. You could have a frame of reference that was fairly substantial, that everybody was forced to agree to whether they wanted to or not, right? There's a thing such as gravity. Right? You can measure and all kinds of stuff like that. So there was an effort, especially in the historical realm, to no longer rely on myths, to see the historical development around you. And so it was felt necessary to look at the Jewish past with that same kind of historical skeptical eye. Just because it says something in the Talmud that something happened doesn't mean it necessarily happened. They wanted to place Jewish culture on a par with European culture. And so they endeavored to have Jewish studies introduced to the university curriculum as a respectable area of study, freeing the field from the prevailing bias that regarded Judaism as an inferior precursor to Christianity and studied as such. If you went to the universities before the beginnings of this time, who taught about Judaism? Christians. And Judaism was, this failed religion. There were these segments that still hung around, but they were defeated by the church. So they wanted to say to them, no. There is a history and a culture called Judaism. It's here. It has as not a precursor to Christianity. It is a legitimate area of study in humanities, like any other area of study in humanities. And they wanted to bring that into the university and to study Judaism with the same techniques and the same formats as any other historical evaluation took place. So that today, for example, this is what you have throughout North America and Europe. York has a Department of Jewish Studies. Toronto has a Department of Jewish Studies. It's not a religious studies group. You don't have to be a rabbi to teach it. As a matter of fact, most of the faculty are professors. Whether or not they have rabbinic ordination is irrelevant. And you can have students in Judaic studies who aren't Jewish. And if you're studying the Talmud in one of those classes, you're not going to be saying, this is what you have to do for your religious life. This is what the Talmud says. This is how it got there. This is what this and that, what have you. And it may be a result of this editor and this and that. And the way they approached the traditional Jewish text was a very different way. In that has highly influential in the non-Orthodox world, including today. So, for example, Leopold Zunz, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, He was born in 1794 and died in 1886. He was one of the Wissenschaft's leading figures and devoted most of his work to rabbinic literature. At the time, Christian thinkers maintained that the Jews' contribution ended with the Bible, and Zunz began to publish in the area of post-biblical rabbinic literature. When the Prussian government forbade preaching sermons in German synagogues on the grounds that the sermon was an exclusively Christian institution, Zunz wrote History of the Jewish Sermon in 1832. And he shows how rabbis, what we call the Midrash today, was really sermons. A certain style of sermon, but nonetheless, it was a religious lecture given to the masses, right? Which is what a sermon is. And he laid down the principles of investigating rabbinic exegesis, how they studied and derived things in of the prayer book. Now, the Wissenschaft movement, and where it gets a lot of critique is in those days, from that time, there was a kind of a tendency to present Judaism as a historical relic. A lot of them thought that what they were doing was giving Judaism a decent burial. Right? Because they saw the challenge of the time and what have you. And now, while Zunz was implementing his ideas of study, how you intellectually approached Judaism, there was a movement that begun to make religious services better understood and more acceptable to at least a certain portion of the community by incorporating music in the local language. And they saw in the local church, the Protestant church, really, the pattern for modern Jewish religious expression. And so there was a synagogue that was opened up and the local rabbis got it shut down because a lot of the earliest pushes were from lay people. You can see that impact if you go to almost all non-Orthodox synagogues. Where do you read the Torah from? In the front of the room, all the way in the front, not in the middle, right? That's where it takes place. That was an innovation brought about because in a church, where does the service come from? The altars at the front. So the introduction of or German or whatever country into the prayer service was because not everybody understood the prayers anymore, if they ever did. Right? And so some of the rabbis at that time who saw and accepted this kind of scholarship and saw the challenge that modernity of the 19th century was giving to Judaism, sought to reform Jewish observance to make it more acceptable to these people. The introduction reform was not they hated Judaism, as some would tell you that they were the in Christian terms, the antichrist of Judaism. They were men, and they were only men at that point, who were genuinely concerned about maintaining the future of Judaism and the Jewish people. And so they, using the Wissenschaft, this structure of scientific study of Judaism, Rabbi Abraham Geiger says Judaism has always changed, practices has always changed throughout the course of history, and today too things can change. What we do today was not the same thing as 4,000 years ago or even 2,000 years ago. And he believed that it made it easier for Jews to live in accordance with Judaism. Right? So this was his ideology. So between 1810 and 1820, a number of synagogues were created and instituted fundamental changes in traditional Jewish practices and beliefs, such as mixed seating, men and women sitting together. It's interesting to note that apparently in the Middle Ages, in churches, men and women often sat separate. Right? But at that time, family pews was the language that was used, at least later on, was the norm. And, you know, why the husband and wife shouldn't be able to sit next to each other? Was their attitude. Only observing one day of the holidays. After all, we know what day, the calendar today, and despite the Talmud saying it's a custom, we follow that custom, we don't need to do it. To show you how that works even till today. In the conservative movement, theoretically, we always observe 2 days of Yom Tov. And the synagogues in general observe 2 days of Yom Tov. A number of years back, permission was granted from some of the law committee to observe 1 day Yom Tov. And you'll look and see, even in the most of the most successful synagogues, conservative synagogues still today, 2nd day Yom Tov, hardly anybody's there. Okay. You know, you want me to stay off from work 1 day? Okay, maybe I can do that. 2 days in a row? God, no, Rabbi, I just can't do that. Right? And they also introduced the use of a cantor and a choir. I don't know if that really, this is my notes here that say this, but there have been cantors around before. And as time went on, some began to really reject a lot of Jewish practices. Circumcision was not practiced, it was decried as barbaric. Hebrew was mostly eliminated from the liturgy. They renounced the hope of restoration of Jews to Israel, the land of Israel, and that Germany was to be the new Zion. The bar mitzvah ceremony was replaced with a confirmation ceremony. Laws of kashrut and family purity are officially declared repugnant to modern thinking people and were not observed. Shabbat for some was observed on Sunday, and traditional restrictions on Sabbath observance was discarded. You know, so this was growing up through the 19th century over in France and Germany. When you cross the ocean, there was this very small Jewish community in Canada at that period. The majority of Jews in North America lived in the United States. The bulk of the Jewish community before the 1840s was of Sephardic descent. And the first Jews to come to North America to settle came from Brazil. We mentioned that they came to New York and all the issues they had there. So the earliest synagogues were Sephardic synagogues. So as soon as the German Jews came in, first of all, of course, you've got our practice and there's your practice, and that already means there's going to be trouble in the synagogue. All right? And a lot of these German Jews had already begun to accept some of the approaches that was in Reform Judaism at the time. And so they wanted to create Reform synagogues. So the first Reform group was formed by a number of individuals that split from Congregation Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina. That already tells you something. We call it a synagogue Beth Elohim. Already, it was a Sephardi synagogue. That's a strange name for a synagogue, right? And so they were in Charleston, South Carolina, where the demands for changes were rejected. So the Jewish way, go make your own shul, right? Or a synagogue. And Reform rapidly became the dominant system of American Jews of the time. It was a national phenomenon that spread throughout the United States. Again, not so much in Canada. I forget the timing of the first real Jew, Holy Blossom. It was a very early synagogue here, which started life as an Orthodox synagogue, which is usually true of most of these communal things. Okay, but there was, all right, so now there was no real control, no central authority. And so it's what everybody did on their own. And indeed, that's part of the Reform ideology. It becomes to be molded by Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. Rabbi Wise came to the United States in 1846 from Bohemia. He spent 8 years in Albany, New York, and I think he got pushed out of there because they thought he was too liberal. And he then moved to Cincinnati, which at that time was still the edge of the frontier, 1846, since Ohio was the frontier. Right? And he really created the structure of Reform Judaism in the United States, which impacted Canada and throughout the world. He helped found the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in 1873. You will note the word Jew in Judaism does not appear in most of this stuff. It was not a good word. Hebrew was the term that was preferred to be used. So that's why it's the Hebrew congregations. Today, it's the Union for Reform Judaism. Okay, but so you see, there are changes that took place in the Reform movement as well. And he edited the first produced Siddur in North America for the Reform congregations in 1873. And he famously founded Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875, which was the premier school of the Reform movement for ordaining of rabbis. We'll talk more about that institution when it comes to the conservative movement. Right? And then in 1889, he founded the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So these, the Hebrew Union College, Hebrew congregations, and the rabbinic body, those three institutions still are, with name changes, the core of the Reform movement. It's important to also note that the congregations created the seminary, their school. So the congregations had greater power within the movement than the central school did. By 1880, more than 90% of American synagogues were Reformed. And in the 1880s was when the mass immigration from Central and Eastern Europe began coming to North America, which was heavily Orthodox and non-German. In the Reform movement was heavily German. And, you know, when they come, many of the Reform congregation at this time were difficult to distinguish from neighboring Protestant churches. The rabbis wore robes like the preachers. There were pews with mixed seating. There were choirs. There were organs. There were hymnals. And some of their leadership, such as David Einhorn, Samuel Holdheim, Bernard Felsenthal, Kaufman Kohler, adopted a very radical approach to the observance of Judaism.
So some started to call themselves reverend rather than...
No, reverend's a different thing. They may have used the term reverend, but reverend was also often was a title given to somebody who was not a rabbi. A lot of the leadership in the early synagogues in North America were led by people who were knowledgeable, but did not have rabbinic ordination. They didn't have smicha. And so they were often referred to as reverend. So, and later on, reverend becomes a term that is used for somebody who has a religious role, functionary role in the synagogue, but is not necessarily a rabbi. So in some synagogues, the shamus, the gabbai, the synagogue, the one who takes care of the religious aspects of the daily services, Torah reading, that sort of thing, and maybe teaching, what have you, it would often be referred to as reverend, with or without ordination. Okay, when I had a shul in Denver, the shul in Detroit that I had, Reverend Bayless was his name, and he was called Reverend. I actually had smicha, but okay. Although I say so, now we're getting towards the end of the 1800s and 19th century. And there was still a kind of a bottom line. While a lot of traditional prayers and rituals had been excluded, there was an opposition for rabbis performing intermarriages. And in 1909, the CCAR, that's the rabbinic body, declared its opposition to intermarriage. And although decried as archaic and barbarian, the practice of circumcision has still remained a central rite. Right? So some things you can't get rid of too easily. And this early radicalism is expressed in what is known as the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform. The Pittsburgh Platform really encapsulated the basic ideas, theology of the Reform movement in the 19th century. And amongst other things, it dismisses such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress as anachronisms that only obstruct spirituality in the modern age. The platforms asserted that Reformed Jews must only be accepting of laws they feel elevate and sanctify our lives, and must reject those customs and laws that are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So you can see the face of Reform Judaism in the late 1800s. It was anti-Zionist, and they felt that being in the diaspora was necessary for Jews to be a light unto the nations. Although some early reform rabbis in this era were involved with the Zionist movement, especially Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. And later on in history, they became more Zionistic. As the years went by, some of this radical aspect of reform was moderated. And by 1935, the movement began to return to a more traditional approach to Judaism, distinctly Jewish and distinctly American, but also distinctly non-Christian. And so what we call the Columbus Platform in 1937, many of the discarded practices were reincorporated into the Reform canon and constitute what's now called modern Reform Judaism. And talked about Jews helping in the rebuilding of the land of Jewish homeland. So to kind of summarize the origins, in the early 19th century, elements within German Jewry sought to reform Jewish belief and practice in response to the Age of Enlightenment and Jewish emancipation. In light of contemporary scholarship, they denied divine authorship of the Torah, declared only those biblical laws concerning ethics were to be binding, and stated that the rest of the halacha, Jewish law, need no longer be viewed as normative. So the Reform movement has undergone changes over the course of time. And certainly after the 1970s and 80s, with a large influx of Jews who came from more traditional backgrounds, they reintroduced some things. I was a kid, I remember going to the Reform Temple, and you were told to take your kippah off. Famously, the Temple Emmanuel in New York, the central synagogue there, same kind of thing. That's their custom. Is you don't wear a tallis, you don't wear a head covering. Today, in most Reformed congregations, you have mixtures. You have some people with a head covering, some by men and women, with and some without. Some with a tallis, some without it. Some with a tallis and no head covering. Some with a head covering and no tallis. And essentially, part of the Reform aspect was the idea of the individual choosing for themselves. And individualism, which is reigning supreme in North America culture, is an important element of understanding Reform and to a certain extent other aspects of movements in Judaism. Now you can understand that there were those who didn't like what was going on. I want to point out, by the way, this means that the Reform movement was the first modern Jewish movement. Nobody had a movement. They were Jews. maybe a Hasidic, a Misnagid, whatever it may be, but it wasn't a movement per se. You had local rabbis, what have you. But they didn't see themselves as part of a larger expanded group that wasn't a group of Jews. So as this begins to come into being, there was a reaction. Some German Jews maintained their traditions and adhered to Jewish law, while simultaneously engaging with a post-Enlightenment society. Now, this group was represented by the work and thought of a man by the name of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Hirsch held that Judaism demands an application of Torah thought to the entire realm of human experience, including secular disciplines. This philosophy is termed as Torah in derech eretz. Torah, that's clear what that means. Im means with. Derech eretz is a complicated and disputed term today. Most, it was understood by many to mean the way of the world. Judaism reigns supreme, but you're not separate from the world. Yeah, you got certain differences you got to observe. But you could study secular studies. Derech Eretz is sometimes referred to as science. In Yeshiva University in New York, his motto is Torah Umada, Torah and science. So this philosophy insisted on strict adherence to Jewish beliefs and practices, but also sought to engage with the modern world. And one term used for this was neo-orthodoxy. Later on, before the term became a little more prejudicial, it became known in North America as modern orthodoxy. Whether Hirsch would feel comfortable with what's called modern orthodoxy today, I don't know. See, for example, the pictures of Hirsch show him in rabbinical in clerical robes with a clerical collar. So they adopted that. No mixed seating. Male choirs were okay. No organ music, nothing of that sort. Strict adherence to Jewish law. Now that movement within the Orthodox world was opposed by what is sometimes referred to as the Old Orthodox. Today, the Haredim. Right? So now, what Hirsch did, amongst other things, was while after the Napoleonic reforms, et cetera, came about, in Germany still, and to some extent a lot of the other countries, there was an organized Jewish community, the Gemeinde in German, or Gemeinde. And Jews paid taxes to that central authority for the Jewish needs. They might pay butchers, they pay the salaries of rabbis and teachers, what have you. When reform really took off in Germany, they became the dominant force in a lot of these Jewish communities. So they ran the Gemeinde. And Hirsch famously decided to take his community out of that, to separate itself from that and declare itself separate and distinct from that umbrella organization. So nonetheless, you would see sometimes their children would go to school in the early hours to learn Torah and then go to the secular school, or spend many hours after the secular school studying. Some of them, the schools were on Saturday, so they would go to the school, they have their non-Jewish friends or colleagues carry their books if they needed to. They didn't take notes, but they attended school classes on Shabbos in order to try and bridge that gap. And then there were those who went to yeshiva, what have you, and Jewish, but not as much at that point. Now, by the early 20th century, there became a very clear distinction between what was called at that time neo or modern Orthodoxy and what we now refer to as Haredi Judaism. And that was when an organization called the World Agudath Israel was formally established in 1912. And that it disagreed with modern Orthodoxy and took a stricter approach. There's a statement in the Talmud that deals with grains and when you can eat certain grains, right? You can't eat the new wheat until after the second day of Passover, right? Because there was the Omer was brought, there was a ritual, there's discussion whether that applies outside of Israel or not. But there was this idea that Chadash, meaning the new grain, Asur min Torah, was forbidden by the Torah until that later date. So playing on that, the new is forbidden by the Torah, they adopted this as a slogan for their approach towards modernity. The modern is forbidden by the Torah. You know, there's a little play on the words, Chadash Asur min Torah. Now, they followed various routes of observance and practices. Some viewed innovation and modification of the Jewish law and custom with extreme care and caution. And so this is what we call Haredi, or sometimes ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Both approaches have proved somewhat resilient. You know, in the 1950s, if you look around, you will hear Orthodoxy is dying. It's on its death legs. The horrors of the Holocaust wiped out the major center of Orthodox Judaism, traditional Judaism in Europe. A lot of Orthodox Jews in North America made some compromises to some level. Their synagogues were in dire straits often. Smaller communities might have an Orthodox synagogue, but there was no real Orthodox minyan there. You might have a rabbi who was the shochet and the moil and did everything else. And he might be the only truly Orthodox person in the community. So they'd have a mechitza, but the mechitza might be very low. Later on, you start to have synagogues where they don't have mixed seating, but there's no mechitza. Men are on one side of the aisle, women on the other. But it was thought that it was the death knell, and that Reform and conservative Judaism, which we haven't touched upon yet, would absorb what was left of Orthodoxy. And in fact, the matter is, especially since 1967, the Six-Day War and other issues that came around it, there has been an upsurge in the Orthodox world. It still remains about 11% of the total Jewish population in North America. But it has a much higher birth rate than non-Orthodox communities. Even the modern Orthodox generally have a higher birth rate than their non-Orthodox compatriots. The Haredim have large families. My oldest son has 7, and if they had been able to, they would probably have a few more. My brother in Israel's got 10. Right? So that, you know, you make do, you survive. You have bunk beds, and you have trundles, and you live in a 3-bedroom apartment or 2, what have you, and, on top of each other. But they're surviving and thriving. There are more people studying today in yeshivot than probably in any time in history. There are issues and there are problems within that world. When Yeshiva University was instituted in 1915, right page here. Yeah. And later, Yeshiva University and its Rabbi Isaac Hanan Theological Seminary was established in New York for training in an Orthodox milieu. If you go to Yeshiva University, I went there undergraduate. I didn't have a yeshiva background, So what the program was that I started with was for people without that kind of background. And so you took 12, normal credit load was 15 to 16 credits a semester. So we took 12 regular credits in basic studies, whatever you were doing, psychology, history, whatever. And in the program that I went to, you got 4 credits for it. But there was almost more hours in that 4 credits than there were the hours in the other 12. If you went to the yeshiva part of it, the full yeshiva, which I did by the end of my sojourn there, you got no credits for the Judaic studies. Everything was in the college studies, although some of the Bible and stuff was taught there in that section. But you spent a significant part of your day in Judaic studies. Right? It was the center for modern Orthodox. Today, there are other training centers as well. And then there are Haredi institutions. If you Lakewood, New Jersey, anybody have heard of Lakewood, New Jersey? There's a huge Orthodox community there that created the largest Talmudic academy in the United States with a student body of over 5,000 students. Okay. Now, Orthodox Judaism's central belief is that the Torah, including the written and oral law, was given directly from God to Moses and applies in all times and all places. And Jews are obligated to live in accordance with the commandments and Jewish law without really any major change. You know, in the Haredi world, especially, nothing. And in the modern Orthodox, maybe around the corner here, but nothing that's really significant. You know, you make a prayer. Well, we always make prayers for the king and the queen or whatever the case may be. So occasionally, maybe they might throw in an English prayer like that. But the services are all in Hebrew. Now, there is no one Orthodox body, right? So there can be no one canonical statement of principles of faith. But as I said, really, almost in the Orthodox world today, if you want to be accepted, you have to more or less accept the 13 articles of faith of Maimonides. Now, there are different ways, hashkafot worldviews within Orthodoxy. The greatest differences within strains are the degree to which an Orthodox Jew should integrate and or disengage from secular society. How much should you be involved with it? And that also goes to your studies. You know, do you study in order to have a occupation, but otherwise anything else is not something that you need to have. Right? And so they don't believe in you going to university. That's why in New York, and I think the same thing exists in Canada, there are often issues with whether or not they give their students in elementary and in high school an adequate secular education so they can really make a living. There are different attitudes towards Zionism in Israel. So, you know, you will have those who will always wear a suit, black suits and a hat, black hats, but it's a normative suit, and it's a fedora. Okay, then you will have, especially in Hasidic streams, but also in what we call yeshivish, they might wear a dark suit during the week, but on Shabbos they wear the longer, what's an Edwardian coat? I think I call it
like a morning coat.
Like a morning coat. Well, long. It's yeah,
silk or satin.
Whatever, you know, it depends on how wealthy they are. You know? And there were the strimals, the fur hats, and everything like that. So, you know, you have various strains. And, you know, what's fun, if you ever go to Israel and go to Meir Sharim, you can find the right tour guide. they can show you which neighborhood is which strain of Hasidim. Or they've talked about Hasidim because they have their different customs and different ways of dress and everything else. Wide socks, the socks under the pants, socks on top of the pants, with the pants tucked into the socks, that sort of thing. Well, the wig, that's interesting. You know, a lot of these things have interesting lives. It's very clear that in the Middle Ages, married women covered their head, Jew and Gentile alike. You know, you see all these pictures. They're not all nuns. That was the standard dress. And there is this idea that a woman's hair is part of her nakedness. And so up until the modern era, women either wore a kerchief or a wig. And in those days, the wigs, you can certainly tell it was a wig. Sometimes today you still can, but right? Some of them you can't. We see in the modern Orthodox at the beginning of the 20th century, some leniency in that area. And you start seeing women wearing hats, which cover the top of their head, but didn't cover all their hair. And even some very important rabbis' wives, you know, don't say that today, dress that way. When Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, came along and he didn't wear a hat at his inauguration, right? And so hats started going out. When women in churches started not to wear hats so much, that affected the Jewish community. But with his resurgence, with what they call the Baal Tshuva movement, people returning to Judaism and Jewish practices, which really came to its heyday in the early 70s. It's where my brother, the one that's just under me, got involved. He was part of that early movement and ended up in Israel yeshiva and living in Israel his life. There was an upswing of more strict restriction in that area. But I daven generally at the Bayit, which is an Orthodox synagogue. You will find women with wigs. You will find women with hats that cover, or scarves that cover everything, or with hats that some of the hair sticks out. That's what my wife does when she wears a hat. She has some wigs too. And then you will find some who wear these silly little things on their head. It's a symbol, I guess. And then the doilies. There's some who put a doily on their head. My mother, bless her memory, that's what she would do when she went to my. All right.
Downstairs.
It's like a plate. It's a tiny placemat. Tiny placemat cut out and sometimes places it's can be lace or what have you, and you got to do it.
Before you go into the sanctuary, there's a basket.
In a lot of conservative synagogues, they have that for the lady. We'll talk. All right. Okay.
But some of the wigs are extraordinary.
Like, well, they see they'll. Yeah, well, they'll. Well, that's one of the that's one of the big debates that you find within Orthodox circles. If the wig, if the sheitel is the Yiddish term for it, the sheitel is for modesty's sake, so that the woman is not attractive to other men besides her husband. Well, this is the idea behind it. The idea behind it, at least in theory, is that this is part of a woman's sexual allure. There's no question a woman's hair is part of a sexual allure, right? That's why women spend a lot of time and money and effort on having nice hair, okay? If that's the case, is it just to look nice and has nothing to do with anything else, but that's become the standard and you want to look nice and you're not interested in attracting other men? Or does it still retain that idea that it is a secondary sexual attraction? So if it is, then that's not supposed, you're out of the business. You're not available. So you should be covering your hair to let everybody you're not available. So now, technically, as long as you're covering your hair, you meet that. But if it's in order not to be, extra beautiful to the outside world, these wigs are better than some of their hair. Yeah,
And they're beautiful.
and expensive. And so there's been a move in some circles to condemn the wigs. So, it goes back and forth.
And they're gorgeous, and they have beautiful hair. I mean, they're modestly dressed, but
Yeah, well, look, everybody's got their own, I love, you walk down the street and you'll see a woman in a hijab with tight jeans on and high heels.
Yeah, I love it.
All right. That's their style. I don't want to, I'm not trying to mock anybody. That's their style. That's what they think is important.
Those wigs.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Now, all right, the third major movement in Judaism was actually the last, the conservative movement. Conservative movement, too, came into being essentially as a reaction to reform. The Orthodox, as an organized movement, to some extent, also mostly disorganized, like the Democratic Party. It was a comedian in the States, I forget his name right now. He says, when he's asked if he's a member of any organized political party, he says, no, I'm a Democrat. What was his name? This goes back to the 30s. Okay. The reform was beginning to go in these radical directions. And there were some who were prepared to institute some minor changes, but found what the reform was doing was far too much for their taste. And so they created what was known as the positive historical Judaism, positive historical school of Judaism in the 1840s and 50s in Germany. And the founder was a man by the name of Rabbi Zacharias Frankel, who had broken with German Reform Judaism in 1845. Interesting enough, they talked about all kinds of stuff that he didn't bat an eye on, circumcision, what have you. But when they wanted to take out the primacy of Hebrew from the religious services, he had enough, walked out. So he became the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau. And when the seminary in the United States was created, we became known as the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. So you can see the influence there. Frankel taught that Jewish law was not static, but rather was always developed in response to changing conditions. He called his approach towards Judaism positive historical, which meant that one should have a positive attitude towards accepting Jewish law and tradition as normative, yet one should be open to developing the law in the same fashion that it has always historically developed. And Frankel felt that the reform movement, what they were doing, was not based on Jewish history. It was not based on the development as Jewish history had taken part. And so he opposed it, although he used a lot of the historical methodology, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, in his study and teaching in his seminary. And that's why the Orthodox would have nothing to do with it. Now, I didn't question the Bible. The Wissenschaft, they left that out from the Bible, but Talmud and other things. Now, what happened in the United States in the 1880s, we had this large influx of Eastern European Jews. Isaac Mayer Wise wanted to create a school for all Jews in America. Okay? And so he got the support of a wide range of religious authorities in the States at the time, including those who were not Reform at all. And he led them to believe that this was going to be a place that would train students for everybody, for all the Jewish approaches, until what is called in the literature, the scientific term, the Treifa banquet. In 1883, at the first graduating class of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, they had a fancy catered affair, which broke every single kashrus law possible. But they had shellfish. They had all kinds of other things there. And so the more traditional inclined walked away. Amongst them was a Sephardic rabbi, Sabato Morayas, and H. Perez Mendez, and they founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York in 1885 as a response to the so-called Treifa banquet. You look it up and you can find the menu online. Now, it was a traditional alternative to Hebrew Union College, but it was still somewhat modern, so the Orthodox world would not accept it. The first graduate of JTS was actually Hertz, the famous Hertz Chumash, who later became chief rabbi in England. And if you look at his comments, while he was open to quoting non-Jews in his commentary, he rejected all these modern biblical criticism, etc. Right? So now what happens is it was floundering. It had a difficult time. It had few students. It had little money. It had few places for them, few pulpits for them to go to be the rabbis of. And so there's also the efforts of a man by the name of Cyrus Adler, who was professor of Semitic languages at Johns Hopkins University. He got a bunch of German Reform Jews together, including Jacob Schiff and David and Simon Guggenheim, Meyer Sulzberger, and Louis Marshall, to contribute the large sum of $500,000. This is in 1900. It was a good amount of money, huge amount of money, to the faltering JTS. And so they brought to New York a famed scholar named Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter was a lecturer in Talmud at the University of Cambridge, and he became the president of JTS. And under his leadership, they brought to the seminary a lot of distinguished scholars, traditional, but also university educated. These used to be names that people would recognize: Louis Ginsburg, Alexander Marx, Israel Friedlander, Mordechai Kaplan, etc. So they founded the seminary under the leadership of Schechter. It was reinvigorated. It began to develop one of the best libraries in the world for Jewish books. Then it created the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, United Synagogue of America's original name, as a synagogue organization. And then there was the Rabbinical Assembly, which was basically an alumni association. Notice the order, though. First came the seminary, then came the congregational groupings. And that meant that the seminary had much more influence over the conservative movement for at least up until the 60s. Well, the reverse was in the Reform movement. The synagogue body had greater influence than the Hebrew Union College. So it did okay. Scholarship-wise, it was well regarded. It was not accepted by the Orthodox, but even some of the Orthodox recognized. You had people who went to Orthodox schools, yeshivot, and then transferred to the seminary for their rabbinic training. The real growth came in the 1950s, late 40s, 1950s, because a lot of chaplains in the U.S. Army were conservative rabbis. And when they came home, these were the ones that these soldiers who had associated with. Most Jews, if they belonged to a synagogue, was an Orthodox synagogue. The Reform was just too much. It was a temple. By the way, the word temple was intentionally used by the Reform movement to say it's not the temple in Jerusalem is not the temple. Our temple is the temple. And in many communities, at least until a certain period of time, and not so much in the Northeast, in a community where you had you'd have an Orthodox shul, you'd have a conservative synagogue, and you'd have a Reformed temple. That's how they would be known. That's what I grew up with. So what happens is after the Second World War, the Jews are moving out to the suburbs. Right? They were leaving their old settlement areas. The Reform, who were already there, it's like going to a church. It just organs, a rabbi in a robe. Well, the robe was okay too. That was around a lot. But no yarmulke, no talis. Everything's in English. I can understand everything. Yeah, that's no good. The Orthodox shuls are hard to move out from the main settlement areas because you have to have a community within walking distance. So there were few and far between Orthodox synagogues. And the conservative synagogues served the bill. They weren't Reform. They weren't so Orthodox that the rabbi spoke Yiddish. He spoke English. They announced pages. They had a prayer book that had the English translations there. They had one prayer book for the synagogue, so everybody was on the same page. They do some responsive readings in English. You'd have a Hebrew school. You sent your kid to the Hebrew school. They had their bar mitzvah. As long as you pay your dues, you got what you wanted for the synagogue. And, if you kept kosher, you may keep kosher. You didn't keep kosher, all right. And then along came in the early 50s a ruling that if you had to drive to the synagogue, there was an opinion that said you could drive to and from the synagogue on Shabbat. And that made it okay in the minds of so many. And the conservative movement became the dominant synagogue body in North America. After 67, after the Six-Day War, and after my generation came along, between hippies and chavurot and do-it-yourself Judaism, the conservative synagogue was really slowly devastated. There were several factors that were going on. One factor was the American individuality. Nobody likes to be told what to do. In the Reform movement, theoretically, everybody can make up their own mind. In the Orthodox world, of course, you ask your rabbi. Right? In the conservative world, you were supposed to be bound by the decisions that came out from the movement. Okay? So let's say before the driving tshuva was issued, everybody you're violating Jewish law. No question, you're violating Jewish law. Once they said it was okay to go to and from the synagogue, okay, now it's all right. But you couldn't say to yourself, you know what, I live too far away, I can't get there, I'm going to drive. That was supposed to be verboten. But people are people. And while the synagogue was conservative, often the joke was you had an Orthodox rabbi in a conservative synagogue for a Reform congregation. Another version of that was the Reform parked in front of the synagogue, the conservative in the back of the synagogue, and the Orthodox around the corner. There's a certain degree of truth to all of that. But the conservative movement had a basic concept of Shabbat, kashrut, holiday observance. At least that was the official picture. Men were expected to wear talis in the yarmulke. They were expected to wear talis and tefillin. It was mostly up until the 60s, very little egalitarian aspect to most synagogues. All right, so now comes the late 60s, early 70s. You have the rise of the women's movement. Demand for greater equality in everything in life. You have this ideal that was around the time of do-it-yourself. Ever hear of the Whole Earth Catalog? Well, the Whole Earth Catalog was something put together by, I'm going to call them hippies, but they weren't really just hippies. All right? How to cook bread, how to do this, on your own, take care of yourself. Right? So they became what was called the Jewish Catalog, which was the same thing. How to make challah, how to build a sukkah, all kinds of things like that. By the late 60s, a lot of the synagogues we're like Beth Emet. Some people like a big shul like this. Some people hate it. They felt lost. They felt that they had no connection. And a lot of conservative synagogues had become very large. And so they started founding Chavarot, which would be groups of people who would get together to pray. Some of them more traditional, less traditional. But there's this pull, this tug that's moving, spinning away from the Reform movement I mentioned had started to become somewhat more traditional. It still had certain things that it did, but it wasn't quite so foreign anymore. And especially these children who grew up in conservative synagogues where their parents didn't keep kosher, they didn't observe Shabbos. The only time they did it was they went to the synagogue, or they went to the youth groups, or they went to some of the camps that were around, and some of them were very successful. The youth group was very successful. The Ramah camps were very successful. Some important leadership in the Jewish world came out of the two movements, the camping and synagogue youth, and some not so great. Founder of SDS was a Ramanic. Anyway, you don't know what SDS was. Okay. I'm the only altar cocker here. I'm not old enough to remember all this. Okay. So you have the reform. You have the rise of intermarriage. You have the conservative movement dead set against performing intermarriage. Eventually, you get the reform movement accepting patrilineal descent. You have women rabbis entering into the reform movement. Slowly, kicking, fighting. I'm one of the fighters and kickers, so I can speak for myself. There was movement afoot within the conservative movement to have women rabbis, to have greater egalitarian aspects of the synagogue life. But the problem was, as I see it, if you wanted to be on your own, do your own thing and be completely egalitarian, that's the reform's right there. And your own lifestyle for a lot of these people is not any different from the lifestyle of the people at the Reform synagogue. If you were very serious about your Judaism, wanted to observe, you wanted to do it in a conservative realm where you could talk Torah with a certain critical eye, and you understood history, and you would be part of the modern world, but at the same time, part of Jewish tradition. It was hard to find a community like that within the conservative synagogues. Camp Ramah, for example, with a very traditional model of prayer service. Most synagogues didn't have that. So a lot of these people drifted off to the Orthodox world. So there was a lot of pull from both ends of the spectrum. And the conservative movement has suffered tremendously in terms of monetary losses, and synagogues have merged and what have you. The age of conservative synagogue is much older, the average age, than in the Reform. We also had some other things that took place. There was a creation of what was known as the Reconstructionist movement. You go to the Reconstruction Synagogue, right? No?
Yeah.
Right? Mordechai Kaplan, who was a professor at the seminary, taught at the seminary, and his ideas of Judaism and civilization, he had great impact on the conservative rabbis at the time, but he was never completely happy. His son-in-law, his follower, they eventually created the Reconstructionist movement, which was very much a non-God movement.
It's very, I've gone to a couple of services.
Well, I'll come back. It was originally, Kaplan didn't believe in a personal God. God cannot command. There can be no such thing as commandments. There were community practices. I forget now the term they uses, but it was to create a Jewish life, a civilization that he believed was important. But he was ready to jettison a lot of these, some of these traditions, although he himself, for most part, was fairly traditional. And like I said, there's no personal God. What has happened is another phenomenon that grew up, nothing to do with any of the major movements per se, and that's renewal or alpha or what have you. There's today there's a wide range of various groupings within the Jewish world that have no connection with any of the more traditional by meaning that they existed around. And they created their own communities, their own synagogues. They now have their own rabbis. Some of us look askance at some of the rabbis, they don't know anything. But anyway, that's not for me to talk about. And Reconstructionism has been influenced, I think, by that. I think Kaplan would spin in his grave if he saw what Reconstructionism is today. I think they moved more. God is not absent from the Reconstructionists anymore. I don't know how their theology is, but there is more of this kind of feeling for the divine that's out there. Right? Kaplan said the divine God is the power for good in the universe. Yeah. 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 Well, there's also a certain degree of blurring that takes place. Yeah. The another thing is called Jewish renewal movement, modern Orthodox, not modern Orthodox, but they call themselves modern Hasidim, or they see neo-Hasids, new Hasidim. And it's related, it has ties with the old hippie world. It has ties with the ecology movements. It has very strong ties with egalitarian visions. And so these renewal, various kinds of institutions that are out there challenging. Both the conservative and the reform are having very difficult times now, financially and membership-wise. I just want to talk a bit. All right, I didn't go over the Hasidim in any great detail. I just want to say a few words about the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement was originally kind of a folk pietistic movement. In essence, in the centers of in Poland and Lithuania, let's say Romania and Ukraine, there very clearly had developed a stringent hierarchy of what it meant to be really a good Jew. To be a really good Jew, you had to be a great scholar. You know, it was scholarship, knowledge of Talmud. That was what we were aiming for. And a lot of people are not capable of that. Most people are not capable of that. And since the wealthy gained prestige by having a son-in-law who was one of these great scholars, there was a clear tendency for the scholarly rabbis to marry daughters of people of wealth. They were observant, but they weren't the same level. They weren't non-observant, right? But they were businessmen. They weren't scholars. So how do you support your son-in-law while he's learning? The ordinary man in the street, the Jew in the street, felt left out, and there was these connections. Who knows how that worked politically and all kinds of other things that may have had an undertow in there. After all, if he's a rabbi, he's related to these people, and he's got to make a decision in terms of a dispute. Is it really going to be that non-biased? Right? So a man by the name of Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, or the Besh, the master of the good name, is credited with creating a movement which emphasized joy, emphasized spirit, emphasized humility as the way to get to God. Okay? And there are all kinds of versions of the story. One version of these stories that's sent around a number of different figures. One version of the story is there's a synagogue and it's Yom Kippur and people are there praying, and there's a little boy in the back of the room and he doesn't know anything. He just knows Aleph Bet. And he can't pray, and the rabbi's standing there and he looks so forlorn, something's not right. And this kid starts yelling out, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Aleph, Beis, Bet, Gimel, Aleph, Hey, and and everybody's, still. And the rabbi stops them. He says, our prayers weren't going to heaven until this little boy, with all of his might, said Aleph, Beis. That opened the doors to heaven so the prayers could go up. Not knowledge, but fervor and spirit. Another version is there's a guy out in the middle of the woods, and a rabbi comes by one day and he says, how do you pray? He says, every day I get up, I wash my hands, I say, thank God, it's another day, thank you for everything, and then I go about my work. The rabbi says, that's not what a Jew does. So he spends a week or two there with them, and he teaches them how to say some of the prayers and what to do, and dot. And then the rabbi goes on, and a few days later, the guy doesn't know what to do. Can't remember what the rabbi taught him. He doesn't have that prayer to God they had before. He has nothing. So these kinds of ideas are what you find in the Hasidic development. And what they also did, they centered around a charismatic figure, a Rebbe, a tzaddik. And here's where they get into a lot of trouble with some of the non-Hasidim, that the role of the Rebbe becomes more than pastoral. He becomes the be-all and end-all of your life. You want to know who to marry? You ask your Rebbe. You want to know if you go in this business venture? You ask your Rebbe. Now, your Rebbe's an important person. Important person should have a good home. He should go around in a nice carriage. He should wear fine clothes. And so money was given, and some of the and sometimes quite large fortunes were in the hands of these rebbes. Some of them were charlatans, some of them were very pious individuals, run the gamut. There were a number of changes in the prayer book that was instituted based upon mysticism in the Zohar, which set kind of apart, but that was bridged later on. But when it first came up, it started coming into being, the leadership of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe were very much opposed to them. And they put them in cherem, they excommunicated them, and back and forth. People were turned over to the authorities saying that they're practicing another religion and they can't do that. They have to be either Christians or Jews, and they're not being Jews. So all kinds of stories like that. And various groups grow up out of this, centered around a specific rabbi, a rebbe. Some of them became quite large. Some of them got their name from the city in which they lived. For example, there's the Belzer. The Belzer Hasidim hail from Belz. Then you had Ger Hasidim, which is the largest Hasidic movement, by the way, far larger than Chabad, come from the city of Ger. Most part, they wore the long black coats. The payas are always very long, don't shave at all. As time has gone by, it's clear that they've more and more moved away from any contact with the non-Jewish world, even more than originally, and become much more conservative in their religious interpretations of Jewish law. So now they're part of that religious establishment that way. The one that's most known to people is Chabad. Chabad was founded by Lubavitch, the rabbis from Lubavitch, Schneerson, and the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe, was one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov. And Chabad comes from the three words, Chochmah, Bina, Dat, or Das, wisdom, Chochmah, understanding, and knowledge. And that's what Chabad comes from, Lubavitch or Chabad. And they very much became an outreach movement. So it's become one of the major forces today in the Jewish world. There are probably more Chabad synagogues today in Toronto than anything else. But normally what those usually constitute is a Chabad rabbi, maybe a few real Chabadniks there, and then everybody else. who may or may not be observant at any level, but they have strong reach out. They fund themselves. They're very good at marketing and getting funding. So they have low or no dues to speak of. So that attracts a lot of people who want to belong to a synagogue, but they feel they can't afford to pay the dues to the synagogues. And so they've become an important element today. So the Jewish world is much more complicated than it was when I first started teaching this class 20 years ago. It used to be you talked about Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, then we and Reconstructionists maybe a little bit in some of my favorite group, traditional Judaism, but that was it. Now you got all these other offshoots and all these things that are going on right now. This has nothing to do with the picture in Israel. You have to know this is a North American, somewhat European as well. Canada, just real briefly, Canada was always much more traditional in general until recently. It had a larger population that came after the Second World War, a larger percentage of Holocaust survivors than in the United States. It had strong Orthodox synagogues, and a number of strong conservative, very weak Reform until recently. It used to be centered around Montreal. That was a major. And then, of course, with everything went on in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, Toronto began to take over. Now, I was trying to find the best numbers, and I can't find anything very good. Well, anyway, in the U.S., the Pew research said about a quarter of U.S. Jewish adults do not identify with the Jewish religion. They consider themselves to be Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background, and have a Jewish parent or raised Jewish, but they answer a question about their current religion by describing themselves as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular rather than Jewish. Among Jewish adults under 30, 4 in 10 describe themselves this way. At the same time, younger Jewish adults are much more likely than older Jews to identify as Orthodox. Among Jews 18 to 29, 17% identify as Orthodox, compared with just 3% of Jews 65 and older. And finally, fully 1 in 10 Jewish adults under the age of 30 are Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox, 11%. Now, in Canada, the total Jewish population is around 391,665. 16.9% of Canadian Jews are 65 or older. 25% of Quebec Jews have French as their mother tongue. 62% are bilingual. Median income for Canadian Jews 15 plus is $30,670. 6.7% of Canadian Jews live in a female-headed single-parent families. That's one of the most important distinctions. 14.6% live below the poverty line. Toronto has about 188,710. I don't know which study this number comes from. See, in 2000, the numbers released on 2022, October 26th, says a total Jewish population in Canada of 335,000 people. Well, that starts with people age 15 and older. Right. I don't know why they use that number. It's a really, but that's what, all I can do is tell you what these figures that I dug up some point. Now, this number, so around 335,000 reported being Jewish in 21. This number has changed little over the past 20 years. In 2001, it was 330,000. Although Canada's total population grew, the proportion of the population of Jewish religious affiliation decreased slightly from 1.1% in 2001 to 0.9% in 2021. So at least, like I said, about 188,000 plus in Toronto, 90,000 plus in Montreal, 26,000, just a little bit over in Vancouver, 14,000 Ottawa, 13,000 Winnipeg, 8,300 in Calgary, 5,500 Edmonton, 5,100 Hamilton. I'm rounding all these numbers. Victoria, 2,700, London, 2,600, Halifax, 2,100, Windsor, 1,500, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, 2,000, and Kingston, about 1,100. If you look around, you'll see that I don't know what percentage belongs to what institutions, things here. It's in a flux. And the COVID has made a devastating attack on synagogues across the board. And we haven't finally recuperated out from that totally. The Orthodox were not as damaged, although so they're only beginning to see a return to the numbers that they used to have coming to synagogue services. And the conservative and reform movements, those numbers have not returned.
Can't even get a minion turn on Friday.
And broadcasting services has become fairly de rigueur in a lot of places. And for better or for worse, that's how they're surviving. But it's an interesting question. We live in interesting times in terms of the religious world. But I think it's safe to say that with the patterns we have right now, the Haredi percentage of the population is going to continue, percentage of the Jewish population going to continue to grow. Somewhat numbers are growing as well, but not as rapidly as we might think. There's always some fallout. Some people leave, some people enter. The number of non-Orthodox synagogue membership is decreasing rapidly. So, things can change. Things have always changed, so that who knows what will be tomorrow. But that's pretty much the state of affairs right now. Okay. Next week, the rest of the calendar, the holidays, summertime, and the following week, we have the exam. And I'll do it like I've done other times. I will send the exam home by email. You will do it at home, and then you'll come to class, and we'll mark them together in class. And you must contact your sponsoring rabbi to where you go after this. All right. I was at a Beit Din today, but one was a baby that was born a few months ago, and the other was a kid that his mother never converted, but he grew up Jewish, and so we took him to the mikveh. And next week I'm sitting on a Beit Din for half a dozen people. So we'll see what it will be. Okay.
Thank
Good night.
you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good evening. Have a good weekend. We are here next 2 weeks. God willing, I apologize for having to cancel out that other night.
Will you be sending the exam next week?
I will send it sometime next week.
Okay.
Probably, maybe. I can't guarantee when it will be.
Okay.
I have to put it together.
Of course.
All right. Good night.
Okay. Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.